Be seated. The state has one more witness, and then we will be done for the weekend. Okay, Ms. Timmons.
State calls Dr. Timothy Huntington.
Please raise your right hand. You promise the testimony you're about to give will be the truth and nothing but the truth. I do. Have a seat. Ms. Timmons.
Would you please introduce yourself to the jury?
My name is Dr. Timothy E. Huntington. It's Huntington.
Dr. Huntington, what do you do for a living?
I'm an associate professor of biology and criminal justice at Concordia University, Nebraska, and I'm a forensic entomology consultant.
And where's Concordia University?
Concordia University is in Seward, Nebraska. It's about 25 miles west of Lincoln.
Can you just give us a brief description of your educational background?
Yes, ma'am. I have a Bachelor's of Science in Biology from Concordia University from 2002. I have a Master's of Science in Entomology from the University of Nebraska, specializing in forensic entomology from 2005, and a PhD in entomology, again, specializing in forensic entomology from the University of Nebraska in 2008.
What is entomology?
Entomology is the study of insects and related arthropods.
How did you get interested in that?
I took an entomology class when I was an undergraduate, and it's one of those things where the more you learn about it, the more interesting it gets.
Now, you also said you were a forensic entomologist consultant.
Yes, ma'am.
What does that mean?
Forensic entomology is the use of insects and related arthropods as evidence in legal investigations. And so I specialize in that discipline to answer questions and help in investigations.
Basically, you're looking at the insects as evidence.
Yes, ma'am.
Talk about what you teach again at the school.
So I'm about 2/3 biology, so I teach classes like general biology, anatomy, or gross anatomy. I teach forensic science classes, and then about 1/3 of my teaching is in criminal justice. So I teach introduction to criminal justice ethics, things of that nature.
You also have a law enforcement background as well.
Yes, ma'am. I'm a certified law enforcement officer by the state of Nebraska.
Do you work anywhere in that field?
Yes, I'm a part-time deputy sheriff for the Seward County Sheriff's Office.
Now let's talk about your consulting. Have you testified as an expert witness in the field of forensic entomology?
Yes, I have.
How many states and counties have you testified in?
I've testified in 6 different states. I couldn't tell you.
I apologize, I said counties, I meant countries.
Oh, countries. I've only testified in the United States, but I've consulted in 3 other countries.
Did I ask you to put together a curriculum vitae or a resume before trial?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Have you had a look at State's Exhibit 123?
That's my CV.
And will that better lay out your educational background and your training and your history?
Yes, ma'am.
This time the state would offer Exhibit 123.
It's admitted.
How does that work then if you're hired as a forensic consultant?
Anytime I get a case, someone will call me up. It may be an investigator from a law enforcement agency. It may be someone from a medical examiner's office, maybe an attorney, sometimes even private individuals will call me and say, hey, we've got this kind of a case. Would you be available to look at it? And my answer is always the same. I will look at it. I'll tell you what I think. If it helps you, great. If it doesn't help you, I don't really care. I'm just going to tell you what I think.
Have you been hired by both the state and the defense as an expert witness?
Yes, ma'am.
In fact, you testified on behalf of the defense in the Casey Anthony case in Florida, correct?
Yes, ma'am.
Are you board certified?
Yes, I am. I'm certified by the American Board of Forensic Entomology, which is the certifying board for forensic entomology. It's the only one in the world.
How many forensic entomologists are board certified in the U.S. and Canada combined?
Right now, about 17.
All right, so let's talk about insects a little bit. It's my understanding that it's the life cycle of insects that are important in forensic entomology.
Generally speaking, yes.
Do all insects have the same life cycle?
No. Some insects barely change throughout their life. Some of them start out looking very similar to an adult insect when they're born, and they just kind of get bigger. Some of them change very dramatically in terms of habitat, where they live, what they eat, what they look like. It really just depends on the insect.
So what's the importance of an insect's life cycle to forensic entomology?
Much of the time in forensic entomology, I'm being asked to answer questions about timelines. The vast majority of cases I work in forensic entomology involve estimating time of death of an individual. And so if a decomposing body, for example, is found and there are insects developing on it, I look at the age of the insects, where they're at developmentally and how long it would take for them to get there, and use that as an estimate of what I call the postmortem interval, or the time between death and discovery. And it has everything to do with the development and how long that takes for the insects.
Now, are you ever able to give exact times like we see on TV, or is it more of a range?
It's a range. It's not really like it is on TV.
All right, let's talk about your involvement in this particular case. How did you become involved in the investigation of the death of Sterling Cohen?
I received a phone call from the Iowa State Medical Examiner's office. I do all of their entomology consulting, and was told that they had insects associated with some remains, and was originally asked if I could make a time of death estimate using those insects.
All right, so obviously you agreed to that.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, and then what happened?
So they shipped me the information, the insect specimens that were collected. I received a CD or a DVD of photos from the autopsy, as well as a form that I have them fill out that includes a lot of the details about the case. That was all shipped to me by FedEx overnight. And then once I receive those, I'm able to process the insect samples and then go through all of the information to see what all I actually have.
Dr. Klein talked about how he saved some live maggots, and he also had some dead maggots to send to you. Is that important to have both?
Yes. So the dead maggot, dead insects that I receive from casework are important because it's freezing in time what is there at that moment of discovery where they're finding things. It stops the insect from developing, obviously, because it's dead, and that lets me know what's actually there when the body is available in this case. The live insect samples are generally extremely helpful because insects, it's important to identify the insects to species because every species is very different. Maggots don't look anything like adult flies. You might think that one maggot pretty much looks like every other maggot, and you're mostly right about that. And so it's sometimes very difficult to identify which species I'm looking at if all I have to look at are immature insects. So the live samples are very convenient, for lack of a better word, because I can just rear them out to an adult stage where it's much easier for me to identify it and confirm the identification that I would make using the immatures. So the live samples are not necessarily a requirement to have. They're just really, really nice to have, and I appreciate getting them.
And you say rear them out. Basically, you let them grow and develop, and then they turn into what they do, and you can say, oh, that's this type of fly.
For the most part, yes. Sometimes I have to actually feed them if they're still eating, but yeah, that's the gist of it.
Now, in addition to the insect evidence, did you ask for any other additional information in order to complete your evaluation?
The two other key pieces of information that I requested and received were photographs, so I could put everything into context. Having an insect sample is great, But without being able to put it in context, if I'm not there, I need to be able to do that. And then temperature records from the apartment were also given to me.
I assume it would make a difference if a body is found outside in 20-degree weather as compared to inside a hot room that's 80 degrees.
It makes a huge difference, both to the insects, to the decomposition. It makes a huge difference.
All right, and then why did you want, did you also ask for digital photos from the autopsy itself?
Yes, ma'am.
And why do you want those?
So again, those put that into context, because if someone else is collecting the insect samples and I'm not the one actually doing it, I don't know what they were looking at or the conditions or any of those kinds of things, and it just helps me put it into context. Sometimes maybe a sample gets missed that should have been collected, and that's observable in a photograph. It just helps me complete the picture.
After you received all the information in this case, what did you do in your analysis with the information that you had been provided?
So to start off with, I look at the identification of the insects themselves, because every insect species develops differently. And anytime I'm looking at insect development in terms of estimating a time period, I need to know what I'm looking at. So to do that, the preserved samples are viewed underneath a microscope, looking for the physical characteristics that are diagnostic for each species. There's published keys in the scientific literature that helps you narrow things down to figure out what you're looking at. And then in this case, the live sample, I transferred it to a different container to rear out in the laboratory.
So you raised the maggots?
I attempted to. In this case, it didn't make it.
Were you able to identify what they were?
Yes. In this case, both samples that I received the one live, the one dead sample, were both identified as the same fly. It's called a scuttle fly. Scuttle flies are small brown flies that you've probably seen around garbage cans, or sometimes people see them in their kitchen. A lot of times people call them fruit flies or gnats, but they're actually scuttle flies. The scientific name for it is Maggots scalaris, but I'll just call it a scuttle fly, so you don't have to try to write that down.
Are there different types of scuttle flies?
There are many different types of, the scuttle flies are in the fly family called Pyophilidae, which there are many different species. Scuttle flies are most commonly Maggots scalaris, and that's kind of the most common species that we run across.
And this is a common fly in Iowa?
Yes, it's actually what we would call a cosmopolitan fly. You can find it pretty much anywhere in the world, and it's very closely associated with human dwellings, and so anywhere there's humans, there's garbage, and anywhere you have those two things, you have scuttle flies.
Now, how did you know in this case it was a scuttle fly?
Looking at the maggots, the maggot and the pupa that I received, they're diagnostic from those physical characteristics. They're very small for the stage of development they're in. They have kind of a characteristic physical appearance in terms of shape and length, and they have small little fleshy spines, and they're fairly easy to identify if you're a bug guy.
And you said pupa. I don't know if you could explain that term now.
Certainly. So a pupa is that in-between stage between larva and adult. So in butterflies, you might think about the caterpillar turning into the chrysalis, turning into the butterfly. In the case of flies, the higher flies, you have a maggot, which then turns into a pupa, which then turns into an adult fly. So it's that in-between stage, that chrysalis stage of development.
Is there a simple way to explain their life cycle and what the importance of that is to you?
Certainly. So what I usually try to tell people is when we talk about fly development, they go through a complete metamorphosis And if you remember back to grade school when you learned about butterflies or things of that nature, they start out as eggs. The female fly lays eggs, and those hatch out into very small maggots. Those maggots feed for a while, they shed their exoskeletons, and then they grow into a little bit bigger maggot. And they do that again. There's 3 different stages of maggot development. Once they do that, they crawl away from the food source generally, and then find a place to pupate, and that exoskeleton hardens around them, and that's, again, that chrysalis stage, and that's what the adult fly forms inside of and then eventually emerges out of. So if you think butterflies and maggots and flies, very similar type of development.
Each of those stages takes a particular amount of time?
Well, the time is really dependent on temperature.
All right, now what significance in this case does it have that these were scuttlefies?
Most of the time when I received insects from a deceased body, they're blowflies, which is flies that specifically eat dead things, or flesh flies, or something like that. Scuttle flies are more generalist. You're much more likely to find them on the garbage in your backyard or the animal feces that you have on your property than you would be on a dead body. Not to say that they don't show up on dead bodies, but they're just more commonly in those other areas. So when I first received it, I knew that something was different about this case, being a insects from a dead body, because they're not the usual suspects, so to speak.
You would have, had the body been dead for a long period of time, you would have expected to see a blowfly.
Absolutely.
What's the term myiasis mean?
Myiasis is an infestation of fly larvae or maggots while you're still alive. It comes in various forms. When most people think about myiasis, they think about having a wound, like a necrotic, kind of festering wound that attracts flies, and they lay eggs, and you have maggots in your wound. Interestingly enough, those are the same flies that are most commonly on dead bodies, the blowflies. And that's not what this was in this case. This is termed facultative myiasis, because it's not necessarily a festering wound that the maggots are attracted to, but in this case is more feces, urine, kind of an unsanitary body condition.
And based on the photographs and what you learned through your investigation, that, in your opinion, is that clearly what happened here?
Yes, absolutely. The maggots in this case are the result of a myiasis infestation, not post-mortem.
All right, so it's your opinion, and you hold that to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty, that Sterling was alive when he was infested?
Yes, absolutely.
Do you have an opinion as to how long Sterling had been infested while he was still living?
Yes. The period of infestation for those maggots to develop to the stage that they were at would have been between 9 and 13 days.
Would that make August 20th being the latest date at the minimum when the infestation could start?
That would put it at, the 20th or 21st would be the last possible date, and it certainly could have been before that.
Do you have an opinion as to whether during this period of infestation that Sterling had been cleaned, bathed, or been moved at all?
Yes.
And what is that opinion?
The maggots, in association with Sterling's diaper, were there primarily to feed on, they were attracted to one of really 3 things, either the feces, the urine, or the extreme diaper rash. If there had been bathing or diaper changing or changing of the clothing or bedding, things of that nature, those maggots would have gone with the changing. So if you think about maggots in a diaper full of feces, you change a baby's diaper, you wipe off the feces, that takes that food source with it, and those maggots are going to be associated with the food source. So had any of that taken place, those maggots would have gone away. They wouldn't have been developed to the stage that they were found in.
And you hold that opinion to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty?
Yes, ma'am.
All right, let's start first with the period of infestation. How did Sterling get infested in the first place? How do these flies know to go to him?
Flies have a very powerful sense of smell. And so if you think about a fly, that antenna that they have, those two antennae that they have on the front of their face, are all about detecting smells. And for a female fly, once she's ready to lay eggs, all she's doing is looking for a place to lay eggs. And so they want to pick out those places that are going to be favorable for their babies to do well. And in this case, again, the feces, urine soaking, and then that kind of an extreme diaper rash could have been attractive. Any of the three could have been an attraction to those flies, and they're going to try to gain access. For the flies to lay eggs, they have to be able to get to it, because they're not just going to dump out eggs somewhere and hope that their maggots crawl to it. So there's going to be a period of time where the flies are crawling into the area, trying to get access to that diaper area.
How long would Sterling have needed to be in that dirty diaper before that attraction started?
Well, the attraction can certainly start right away, because anybody who's ever been around little kids, you know when a kid has a dirty diaper. If you can smell it, the flies can smell it way before you can. And so that would be enough of an attraction for the flies to say, hey, there's a spot I can lay eggs. But for the flies to actually get to that area would have taken some more time. Diapers, of course, are designed to keep all of that stuff in, right? That's why we buy diapers. And so that's going to provide a pretty extreme barrier for the flies to gain access, and it's going to take them some time to defeat those barriers.
And how do they do that?
Well, they can certainly smell it, and then once they can smell that attraction, they look for just about any way they can to get into there. Now, it depends on if the flies are even in the apartment, for example. So if they're not in the structure, they have to get access into it, opening doors or even crawling underneath the opening of the door.
Are you saying a fly could have been outside of the apartment building but still smelled that?
Certainly, yes. And so any of those kinds of things provide barriers, and the flies are going to need to get access into there. They're not going to necessarily always fly in because they can walk. Once actually at the site where there's clothing and there's a diaper and everything, they're basically going to be crawling. So in this case, it would seem reasonable that they would crawl up a pant leg, for example, to get to that edge of the diaper and then kind of find a tiny little gap. These are very small flies. Again, if you think of that kind of gnat or fruit fly size fly. So it's going to be very, very difficult to totally keep them out, but it's still going to take them some time to gain access.
And what kind of time are we talking about? Just hours, days, do you know?
It would seem reasonable that the barriers provided, so the diaper, the clothing, the blanket, being in an indoor structure, it would probably about a day or so after the soiling would take place would be an appropriate period of time to delay that infestation.
Sounds like they go to a lot of work to get to the source that they want to be at. Is that fair?
Yes, and again, if you think about it, it's a limited resource And so the flies are really going to do their best to make sure that they lay their eggs and to have that next generation.
For these flies to get into Sterling's clothes and his diapers, what does that say about his mobility?
If you've ever tried to swat a fly or shoo away insects, if they're crawling on your food at a picnic or something like that, you know that as soon as you start your swing, they take off because they're very, very sensitive to anything that's dangerous around them, and they can see you moving basically in slow motion. Their nervous system is very, very fast. And so they're very sensitive to any kind of movement or dangers to them. And so any kind of movement would have provided a hindrance for the flies gaining access. You've probably experienced where insects are crawling on you and you move your arm and suddenly they fly away. And that's pretty normal. So in this case, for the flies to gain access to the point where they're crawling, up a pant leg, gaining access to a diaper, Sterling would have had some mobility restrictions or almost moribund to the point where he's really not moving a whole lot. And if you think about, a child kicking its legs or flailing its arms or, wiggling, because that's what babies do, that would generally be enough to keep flies from really spending much time there. So it would seem that he wasn't doing that.
Once the flies had access to Sterling, what did they do?
So the female flies are going to spend a little bit of time checking out the area, so tasting or even feeding on the available tissues, and then they're going to start laying eggs. So one female scuttlefly will lay around 50 to 100 eggs. That will create an attraction for other female flies to come in and lay eggs in the same area. Male flies may show up and virgin female flies may show up because it's a place for them to meet. And so there's going to be a time period, minutes to hours, once they gain access to once they actually start laying eggs.
Do you know how long that process is?
Minutes to hours. It depends on the individual fly.
And it sounds like once eggs are laid by one fly, it's going to start attracting others.
There's a pheromone attraction because there's a benefit for the maggots to be surrounded by other maggots.
In this case, are you able to say the time frame of when the maggot eggs were laid?
So the eggs would have been laid between that 9 and 13 days prior to discovery. And so then if you add about a day for the flies to actually get in there, it would push it back to 10 to 14 days.
What happens after the eggs are laid?
Once the fly eggs are laid, they're going to take a little bit of time for the eggs to hatch. Once the eggs hatch, small maggots are going to crawl out of those eggs, and immediately they're going to start feeding, again, on the feces and or body fluids that are going to be in the area. And as they feed, they're going to grow to that second stage. They'll shed their exoskeletons and progress through that life cycle.
How long does it take the eggs to hatch?
It depends on temperature.
Okay, so let's talk about temperature from the scene. How did you determine what factor the temperature played in this particular case, in the development of the eggs?
Temperature, the temperature development in insects is well studied. In this particular case, I used a scientific publication from 1991 that detailed out the development of this particular species under different temperature regimes. And we use a process called the degree day principle, where you can calculate time periods at different temperatures and how long it takes for the insects to develop. So if you think about it in terms of baking, if it takes you 15 minutes to bake some biscuits at 350 degrees, it may take 12 minutes at 375. It may take 18 or 20 minutes at 325. The same principle is applied a lot in agriculture. And so looking at the publications and showing those temperature requirements to reach certain stages of development, I use the temperatures that the insects actually experience to calculate the time durations. In this case, the scene temperature was recorded at 85 degrees Fahrenheit, and that was the primary temperature that I used to make my calculations.
Did you do anything else to verify that?
Yes. One of the things that I always am concerned with in biasis cases, cases where the maggots are infesting a live person, is if our normal body temperature is 98.6 Fahrenheit, that's a pretty big difference from that 85 that the scene temperatures were recorded at. And so I want to know what the actual temperature would be. I want to be as accurate as possible. I don't like to make mistakes. And so I used a colleague of mine who had a daughter that was roughly the same age. I believe she was 4 months at the time. And I had him use a thermometer and check the temperature inside of her diaper in the mornings, first thing when she woke up. And the reason I did that is because that's the most likely time that she's going to be soiled, and nobody's going to be changing her diapers. She's going to be stationary more or less. And that temperature is about 91.5 degrees Fahrenheit for the time period that he recovered those temperatures.
Okay. Did that do anything to change your opinion?
It changes the calculations slightly. It basically shortened it by about a day. So that would make it that 8 to 12 days instead of 9 to 13 days of insect development. But it didn't really change the opinion, and the reason for that is because most of that development that those flies are experiencing actually take place outside of that area inside the diaper. Because those maggots crawl away before they pupate, once they've pupated, they're going to be in the ambient room temperature. So I think if it would have made a bigger difference, if it would have been a 3 or 4 day difference, it would have really meant something. But in this case, it didn't seem to be all that significant.
So what happens after the eggs are hatched?
So the eggs hatch, the insects continue developing as maggots, feeding, and they're going to keep growing through those 3 stages of maggot development, and then eventually they're going to crawl away and pupate. And they crawl away because they're basically vulnerable as puparia or pupae. They try to get away from the food source because that might attract predators and things like that. And so they're looking for a spot to pupate, and that's what they do.
So in this particular case, with Sterling's diaper, they're feeding in there as larvae, but where are they crawling away to pupate?
So in this case, the photographs taken at Autopsy showed that they were pupating in the bedding and on the clothing material outside of the diaper. They wouldn't pupate inside of the diaper, and so that in the bedding area and on the blanket, places like that around are where they chose to do that.
And what happens once they pupate?
Once they pupate, they continue developing until they emerge as adults. It's kind of like thinking about that butterfly hatching out of a chrysalis.
And it's this particular life cycle that you talked about that lets you know this 9 to 13, 10 to 14 days of infestation.
Correct.
Okay. And I should say 9 to 13 days prior to death, correct?
Correct.
All right, first responders observed these scuttleflies flying around Sterling, and notably when they lifted his blankets up. So what does that mean to you?
So there's 2 possibilities there. One is that Scuttleflies, unlike most of the flies that I deal with, will keep laying eggs for as long as there's food. So if there's a food source that's been there for 20 days, they will keep colonizing it as long as it's usable. So those could have been flies that were there simply because there's still that attraction, and maybe they're still colonizing or hanging out in the area. The other possibility is that some of those puparia had actually reached that point of completing development and the adults are actually emerging, which would then be that second generation of flies coming off of the remains.
If Sterling was awake during this process and alive, could he have felt this, the flies and the maggots crawling on him?
Yes.
Do you know what that feels like?
I've held maggots and flies on a number of occasions, and it's a crawling sensation. If you've ever held a caterpillar or an earthworm or something like that, there's little bristles on the underside that you can feel. And reports of people that have wound myiasis, for example, report a crawling sensation. And certainly in a sensitive area like the urogenital area, you would feel it.
Sterling had an infection from the diaper rash, and he had that raw skin. Could the maggots have been feeding on his body as well?
Yes.
Can you explain that?
Scuttleflies are one of those flies that can eat a wide variety of things. So certainly they will eat feces and rotting tissues of any kind. And so in this case, while there's not a well-defined wound like a cut or a laceration or something like that, the skin sloughing off the body as it was would certainly be a food source that the maggots could use.
How important is the location of the maggots, to your opinion?
The locations of the maggots is very important because it tells me several things. One is that it ties them in with that facultative myiasis, the feeding in the body fluids outside of the body in this case. And then also it demonstrates that this is a myiasis infestation and not a post-mortem infestation that took place after death.
Why does it tell you that?
When flies colonize bodies after death, they do it in a very predictable fashion. Flies go for openings into the body, and the eyes, the nose, the mouth, places that they can get inside and be protected and have access to the remains. And in this case, there were no flies or maggots or eggs or any of those things in those locations. And they should have been, because there wasn't a tremendous barrier like a diaper in this case that was concealing those areas. And so had these maggots been a post-mortem infestation, it would have been very different as far as location.
Is there any way you can tell the time of death from the insects?
In this particular case, because the insects were antemortem or infesting prior to death, those insects aren't going to be helpful in that way. However, the absence of insects is important, because had Sterling been dead more than a day or so, there would have been insects colonizing the eyes, nose, mouth. There would have been different species there. There would have been a number of differences, entomologically speaking. I doubt that it was more than half a day, but to be safe and conservative, maybe a day.
So maybe a day that he was dead at the most.
Yes.
Did I ask you to pick out a few photographs to help illustrate your testimony?
Yes, ma'am.
And those photographs were from the autopsy, correct?
Correct.
May I approach?
You may. These have already been entered through Dr.
They have
Klein?
not. Dr. Klein laid the foundation, and then I'll have him go through one by one as he goes.
Okay.
So I'm handing you State's Exhibits 119 through 122. Are those the photographs that I asked you, or that you had chosen to show today?
Yes, ma'am.
We'll just go through those one by one before we put them up on the screen.
Okay.
If you would look at Exhibit 119 and tell us what we're going to see in that photograph and what the relevance of that is.
Photograph 119 is a photo of Sterling in the swing. It's a shot taking pretty much of the whole body, and what you would see entomologically is you can see several places where there's maggots crawling away from the site where they were feeding. So these are maggots that have completed development and are looking for a place to pupate.
So you would offer Exhibit 119,
The objection. Okay. Submitted?
permission to publish,
Granted?
and may I continue to publish the rest of them?
You may.
Yes, there's it. Let me get you a pointer. And actually, we've had witnesses come down here so the court reporter can hear you speak. Do you mind doing that?
That would be fine.
So if you could show to us the maggots that you had talked about and why you found this picture important.
Certainly. Right here on, sorry, I'm too tall. Right here on Sterling's right leg on the camouflage pants material, there's a very large maggot that is crawling away from a feeding site. Again, that's diagnostic for a maggot in the prepupal stage, as we call it, looking for a place to pupate. Also, there are several maggots here on the left knee that are doing the same thing. They might be a little bit hard to see in the image, but under increased magnification, you can definitely tell that that's what they are, as well as one here on the left side of the seat belt area there as well. So these are all maggots that are looking for that place to pupate and have completed their development as a maggot.
All right, Exhibit 120, what will we see in that photograph?
Number 120 is another whole body photo of Sterling outside of the car seat, and this one also shows maggots feeding and moving away from the feeding site.
The state offers Exhibit 120.
Submitted.
Tell us what we see there in regards to the insects.
Right here on the left leg, where the pants have been pulled up, there's one clear maggot here just above the fold. That is, again, in a late feeding stage or early migrating stage. Most likely this is a maggot that's looking for that place to pupate. Directly kind of proximal to that on the leg is a cluster of maggots that's actually feeding on the feces in this case. And you can tell that they're feeding because when maggots feed, they have a characteristic head-down cluster appearance. They breathe out of their posterior ends, and so they kind of dig down into the material that they're feeding in. And so here we can see feeding maggots as well as maggots that have completed feeding.
And just for purpose of the record, I used more of a layperson term earlier, but if someone was to look at this photo later on and just reading what we're saying, what you're pointing out looks like a small piece of rice, or similar to that. Would that be right?
Similar to that, yes.
State's Exhibit 121. Please tell us what we're seeing in that.
Number 121 is a whole body photo where the diaper has been pulled away. And so you can see, again, the maggots in the diaper area feeding in the diaper, as well as the conditions where they're at.
State offers Exhibit 121.
Any objection?
And Your Honor,
It's admitted.
Where do we see the maggots in this photo?
In this photo, again, it's going to be hard to see without magnifying it. There are a great number of maggots actually feeding in the fecal material in the front of the diaper as the diaper is opened up. Also, there are a number of maggots feeding at the base and the shaft of the penis, where they're, again, feeding on that fecal material and possibly some of the skin that has begun to slough due to the extreme rash.
In State's Exhibit 122, what do we see in this photograph?
This photograph is of the bedding area, or the bedding material, I should say, in the swing, and shows a number of fly puparia.
State offers Exhibit 122.
no objection, Your Honor.
It's admitted.
Tell us about what we see here.
What you're seeing here are those pupae that I was discussing earlier, the chrysalis stage of the scuttle flies. And this photo is important for a number of reasons. The photos that I received that were taken at Autopsy showed quite a few of these puparia or pupae that were associated with the bedding material, with the clothing, and the insects that I received, the actual samples that I received, were not this advanced. So the photos were really important to me because they're showing that the insects had actually developed well beyond the life stage that I received from Autopsy that were collected by Dr. Klein. This photo in particular, you can see 6 or 7 different pupae here, and you can see that they're in different colors. And the different colors actually represent where they're at developmentally. The cream-colored or maggot-colored pupae are just brand new. They've just made that transition from maggot to pupa. These tan or brown-colored ones are kind of midway in that transition. And then this very dark-colored pupa is very close to completing its pupal stage. And maybe tomorrow, after this picture was taken, it would have emerged as an adult. So this is a very advanced stage of development, and the oldest insects are going to be the most accurate for estimating a period of development. And so those are the key features that I'm looking for, or the key insects I'm looking for making a period of development estimation.
Thank you.
Lights back up. Ms. Timmons? Ms. Timmons, lights back up.
Oh, yes, it is. I'm
Okay.
sorry. So, Doctor, in your scientific opinion, Sterling had not been changed, bathed, moved in approximately 9 to 13 days. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And in your opinion, Sterling, when found on August 30th, 2017, had only been dead for a half a day to a full day.
That is correct.
That's all I have. Thank you.
Cross-examination.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon.
Just briefly, just so I understand, temperature is important because the higher the temperature, the more rapid the development of the scuttlefly.
Within a range, yes, sir.
Okay. And the test that you did with your friend, daughter, they would take the temperature within the diaper for you to give you a sense of the temperature in the diaper area?
Correct.
Okay, and that's the number you used in this particular case to determine the development life cycle of the scuttlefly?
I did it both ways. And the reason I did it both ways is I wanted to see what the difference was And because the 85-degree temperature was the known temperature from the scene that I had, estimating the inside of the diaper temperature was a follow-up to that.
Oh, understood. But which is most important, the inside temperature or the ambient room temperature?
Most of the development for the flies is going to take place at ambient room temperature, so that would put that to be more important.
Thank you, sir.
Redirect.
No, Your Honor.
Can this witness be excused?
Yes.
Doctor, you are free to go.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Any further evidence from the state?
No, Your Honor, at this time, the state would rest.
Defense wishes to reserve starting its case until next week.
Please, Your Honor.
All right. I'm sure we're all happy to call it a day, call it a week. We will resume Tuesday. I want you to hang around in the jury room for about 5 minutes when you get back there. I want to make sure, checking with the clerk's office, what time we're going to start on Tuesday. There may be other matters taking place in your courthouse. We're being accommodated from Chickasaw County, so if there are things that have to take place from Plymouth, we're going to allow them to, we're going to try to accommodate them. The latest, as I understand it, we might start would be 10:30, but if we can start at 9, we will. So just wait a few minutes so I can tell you exactly what time to be here, okay? Continue to heed my admonition. As I said before, I guarantee there has been media coverage. Please don't go look at it. If you do, you will be denying Ms. Harris a fair trial, okay? Have a wonderful weekend.